The cold seeped deeper than stone on that bitter morning, settling in marrow and silence alike. A thin layer of frost had crept over the stones of the Tower of London, muffling the sound of footsteps and breath. In a small, dim chamber deep within the fortress, a girl barely 19 knelt before a wooden block, treacherously smooth from years of innocent blood. Her name was Catherine Howard. She had asked for the block the night before. It was a strange request, yet no one denied her. They brought it like a relic, reverent in the way they avoided her eyes. Now, she knelt before it as she'd been taught back straight, hands folded, chin lifted just so. Her breath curled in the air like prayer. The executioner said it would be swift. One clean stroke. Still, she wanted to be ready. It was the only thing she could control. She pressed her temple gently to the wood, closed her eyes. "I die a queen," she whispered. "But I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Her voice broke mid-syllable, catching on the roughness of the truth. Then, silence again. Only the slow drip of melting frost outside the window. Around her the room bore witness to final hours. A plain nightgown laid neatly across the cot. A wooden crucifix in the corner glowed faintly in the lantern light. Her once bright gowns gone, her jewels confiscated. What she had left was breath and memory. From behind the thin stone walls, the toll of bell echoed out across the waking city hollow and ominous. A herald to death. She didn't tremble. She repeated the posture again, kneeling, placing her hands forward, tilting her neck, practicing grace over terror. Tomorrow, the scaffold would rise. Tomorrow, the crowds would come. But tonight, Catherine rehearsed dignity in a kingdom that had given her none. A shaft of gray light slipped through the cracked shutters of the chamber, falling across the face of a sleeping girl curled awkwardly on a tattered mattress. Her breath came in soft sighs, lost in the noise of distant hooves clattering in the outer courtyard and the shrill laughter of girls chasing each other in thin-soled slippers. This was the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, rambling tangle of rooms in Lambeth, teeming with forgotten children and louder ambition. Among them, Catherine Howardone of many wards and poor relations moved unnoticed, her presence more ornament than person. She had no mother, no devoted guardian. Her father was dead or disgraced, depending on who whispered the story. Older girls taught her to fix her bodice just right, to stand in the flickering glow of firelight, to make her hair shine redder, and to smile with her eyes as well as her lips. It was a world of scandal murmured through tapestries and secrets exchanged like currency. She was 14 when Henry Mannix began touching her fingers under the guise of correcting her lute posture. His voice was soft, coaxing, and she, unused to devotion even, fain drank it in like sweet wine. Later, tea would be called promiscuity. But in truth, she did not even know the word for what she was becoming. There were no handmaids to chaperone after dark, no locked doors before midnight. Frances Derham, older, brash, dangerous with a laugh that promised too much, filled the spaces Mannix left behind. He called her my wife in secret. She had no idea that those words would become her death sentence. Even then, Catherine sensed the fragility of affection, the need to be clever, pretty, noticed. Courtiers passed through the manor with greasy smiles and probing eyes. To survive, she learned to soften her voice and tilt her head just so, always performing. Never quite safe. The air in the Dowager Duchess's household reeked of neglect, masked by faded grandeur. Tapestries hung dusty on the walls, their intricate scenes dulled by years of smoke and silence, and young girls flitted about, like half-watched shadows, overseen with a laxity born from indifference rather than trust. It was here that Catherine Howard absorbed her first teachings in desire and secrecy, under the dim candlelight of a neglected nursery turned dormitory. Henry Manox, her music tutor, was the first to take notice of the girl with the bright eyes and tentative laugh. His compliments disguised as instruction, his touch made to seem accidental, all became routine. Catherine, barely beyond girlhood, confused flattery with affection, and attention with care. When he kissed her fingertips after a lesson, she giggled. When his hand lingered at her waist, she told no one. This was how love began, wasn't it? But even her naivete had boundaries. In time, Manox's cruder advances repulsed her. That void was soon replaced by Francis Derham, who swept in with stories of court and the promise of adult affection. He called her wife, spun daydreams laced with hungry smiles, and pressed deeper into Catherine's need to be cherished, however briefly. Their intimacy felt real beneath the starched sheets and risk of discovery, even if no one had taught her what loyalty, consent, or caution truly meant. Yet within that house, secrets did not remain still for long. Whispers blended with candle smoke. Jealous maids and curious companions saw and remembered. When Derham left, claiming courtier ambitions, Catherine grieved not just the loss of love, but the gnawing sense something had shifted, dangerously so. Her heart could barely understand it, but her instincts stirred. Already, the mistakes of a misinformed child had been written in ink, and soon others would wield those pages like knives. And still she smiled, brushing her hair before the mirror with practiced elegance, unaware that each kindness shared, each glance stolen, was another lesson not in love, but in the limitless deceit of ambition. The candles in the royal chapel flickered solemnly, casting long shadows across groined ceilings and embroidered tapestries. Beneath their dim glow, Catherine Howard stood resplendent in a gown of white velvet, her golden hair coiled in fine braids, her lips painted to perfect composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she knelt before the Archbishop, but her smile, soft, almost disbelieving, never faltered. At only 17 years old, Catherine was becoming Queen of England. Only days prior, Queen Anne of Cleves had been quietly discarded. A political union, torn asunder without ceremony. The court had already begun whispering about the new girl young. Radiant, affectionate, she moved through Whitehall Palace wearing innocence like perfume, and even the tired old courtiers found renewed vigor as they bowed before her. Henry VIII beamed beside her, his swollen frame adorned in gold-threaded robes. His eyes devoured her with possessive pride. She represented something he could no longer claim: youth, passion, the promise of fertility. To him, Catherine was not a person but a portrait of his fading grandeur, and he clung to her as one does a relic of lost glory. Catherine, though dazzled, felt the weight of something else beneath the diamonds and lace. The Dowager Duchess had coached her in gestures of grace, but no counsel could prepare her for the loneliness of a throne. Every courtier's gesture appeared flattering, but behind every smile lurked calculation. Still, she danced, laughed, and bestowed royal favor with a hopeful heart. At night, she stared into candlelight and ran her fingers over the royal scepter presented to her. Somewhere beneath the silk and ceremony was a pulse of fear unspoken, but persistent. She was queen, elevated, enshrined, but in a palace of iron smiles and hidden daggers, she was also prey, gilded and young, now robed in impossible expectation. And somewhere beyond the laughter of feasts and music of lutes, A cold wind passed through the stone halls, whispering of secrets, punishment, and the price of being chosen. The wedding was swift, as if urgency itself whispered to the king. St. James's Palace glittered with candlelight, its silence deeper than reverent. Catherine stood at Henry's side in a gown of ivory damask threaded with silver, shoulders trembling beneath the velvet weight of newly woven royalty. She was 17, barely past girlhood, yet burdened with a crown etched in expectation. Court gossip called her the rose without a thorn, a poetic lie that cloaked political hunger. The Howard family preened as their youngest climbed to queenhood. In the days that followed, Catherine moved like a doll through stately Halseland, delicate, admired. Her new apartments sparkled with gold leaf and tapestries woven in Flanders. But their grandeur only deepened her solitude. Henry was generous, lavishing her with gifts. Gowns of crushed velvet in jewel tones, a sable-lined mantle, a necklace lined with teardrop pearls. But with his affection came scrutinies in every corridor, whispers behind every fan. At first, she reveled in the attention. She petitioned the king for clemency, for imprisoned debtors, smiled as courtiers bowed, tried to act the queen she was made to be. Yet the court was a gilded cage. The king, though momentarily besotted, was distant and declining. That familiar scent of decay lingered his leg wound, rarely healed. Even in his smiles, there was tightly coiled suspicion. She missed laughter, missed youth. Days passed in silence, punctuated by prayer and protocol. Behind the silks, her thoughts strayed to the past, Francis Derham's boastful laugh, the thrill of stolen kisses in the Duchess's chambers, the music lessons with Mannocks. Her secrets, now hidden behind veils and etiquette, seemed like shadows lengthening in the corners of candlelit rooms. In the mirror, a queen looked back. The velvet clung to her shoulders like a shroud. The crown nestled in her curls sat heavier with each heartbeat. The air in the palace was perfumed with expectation, yet thick with suspicion. Catherine walked softly through its corridors, followed by sharp eyes veiled behind practiced smiles. Lips curtsied kindly. Daggers dangled in unspoken words. Her fragile heart, aching for warmth, in a court ruled by ice, had found its balm in Thomas Culpeper. Though he was young, like her, he belonged to a different realm, entirely a man trusted to attend the king at all hours. Their paths crossed often in public, but it was the hidden glances, the half-smiles stolen behind thick velvet doors, that nourished a hunger Catherine barely understood. Jane Rochford had seen it. She had lived it in a different time with her doomed sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn. Yet instead of warning Catherine, she became her silent accomplice, quietly arranging nighttime walks and candlelit meetings under the pretense of embroidery or whispered prayers. When Catherine and Thomas spoke alone, the world fell away. She felt not like a queen, but like a girl with dreams not of crowns or politics, but of laughter in the countryside, of warm hands beside hers, of freedom. Their conversations were hushed and breathless, straining against the edges of treason. A misplaced lock of hair, fingertips grazing silk sleeve each moment, became a risk, scaled beyond logic. But this was a court bent on self-preservation. Walls whispered to one another. Doors breathed gossip into corridors. The same lips that praised the queen by daylight murmured her ruin by dusk. The favor of Henry VIII was a coin too valuable to risk by silence, and so the lovers, thinking themselves secret, continued to weave their doomed tapestry, threaded by affection but stained by fear. Catherine did not know that eyes already followed her. Ears pressed against the floors beneath her feet. Love, in that place, had many names, but mercy was not one of them. The tapestries whispered more than the courtiers did. Every hallway in the royal palace throbbed with the uneasy silence of watching eyes and listening walls. Catherine felt them all, the sidelong gazes of ladies-in-waiting, the ever-present footsteps of guards behind her, the pinched murmurs that stopped abruptly as she entered a chamber. She had been queen for only a few months, but already the weight of the crown dug grooves into her spirit. Jane Rochford stood by her mirror, pretending to adjust a pearl earring. "They are watching more than they ever did when Anne wore the crown," she whispered, half to herself. Catherine's eyes met hers in the reflection, young, questioning, anxious. "Who watches?" Catherine asked, her voice low yet sharp. "Everyone. The king's men, the reformers, even the walls, especially the walls." Catherine tried to laugh, but the sound barely escaped her throat. Her time with Culpeper, while thrilling, had grown reckless. They met in unlocked chambers, lingered too long, wrote when they should have burned every trace of feeling. And now Derham had returned, uninvited and insinuating. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he had power and secrets. She began to notice the pauses when she passed down the corridor, the way even her most trusted attendants offered answers too quickly. Once, she found her own letter addressed to Culpeper tucked back into a book she had not reopened. Someone had touched it. In the gardens, she sat near the roses, still clutching their red summer blush. Thomas joined her, his voice quiet, fevered. "They're speaking of us. I hear it. In the privy chamber." "Then we stop," she said quickly, fighting the tremor in her hands. But denial was a luxury long past. Bishop Cranmer's eyes lingered too long at court dinners. Guards no longer smiled when they looked her way. Behind the embroidered smiles, the court had turned into a maze of sharpened glances, and Catherine, once cherished and beloved, now walked it alone. The chapel royal was shrouded in candlelit quiet, the vaulted ceiling swallowing sound like secrets swallowed by silence. It was here, beneath the pious murals and the ever-watchful gaze of painted saints, that the first whispers began. Feet shuffled softly over stone, knees bent in ritualistic prayer, but eyes drifted sideways toward Catherine Howard, draped in satin and pearls, kneeling alone at the altar with a troubled brow. Jane Boleyn hovered nearby, her expression unreadable. As Catherine rose, the hem of her gown kissed the marble with a low sigh. The girl queen glanced about her, as if the pews had grown eyes. She was no longer certain who was watching, and more terrifyingly, who was listening. It started with a murmur between two court women over their tapestries. "Did you know she's had more than one before Culpeper?" Someone whispered into her embroidery. Another nodded, lips pursed, stitching her condemnation into torsades of gold thread. In corners of the chapel, courtiers bowed less deeply now, each uncertain if loyalty to the queen might cost them their heads. The name Derham slithered its way back into memory. Even Cranmer, who once offered her blessings with calm severity, now regarded Catherine with the measured coldness of a man, preparing for a funeral rather than a sermon. John Lascelles, thin-lipped and sharp-eyed, attended Mass on a particular morning not to pray but to observe. His sister, long silent about the goings-on in the Dowager Duchess's household, had spoken. And now, justification for reform hung delicately in the palm of his hand. Later that evening, as bells tolled vespers, Jane approached Catherine in the chapel's cloister. "We must speak carefully," she said, her voice barely a tremor. Catherine blinked, her lashes fluttering like moth wings. Something in Jane's demeanor chilled her. They've begun asking questions. The incense still clung to the air, sweet and heavy, but amidst its perfume now lingered something far more sinister, the scent of fear. The air inside the Queen's apartments was sodden with stillness, the hush of dread making a mockery of the tapestries that had once rustled in joy. A servant's footfall echoed like a drumbeat of death. Catherine sat by the cold hearth, fingers twitching in her lap. She hadn't wept not yet. Terror had dried her tears. In her palm, clenched tight until the parchment softened with sweat, was the letter. They had discovered it in Thomas Culpepper's chamber. A simple missive, easily lost among the brocade and scented silks of court, now transfigured into a dagger, pointed at her throat. The letter bore no grand confessions, no explicit love lines, but its sentiment betrayed her. Yours as long as life endures. She had penned the words in her rounded, youthful hand, unaware they would be summoned in Parliament as evidence of high treason. Her language was tender. Yes, but, in the eyes of the king and his men, it was damning affection, dripping with disloyalty. Archbishop Cranmer stood mutely at the edge of the chamber when he handed Henry the damning bundle. Culpepper's testimony, Derham's confession, under duress, and the letter. Henry trembled not with grief, but fury, his bloated hand crumpling the parchment before lurching to his feet. His voice, usually so grand, cracked. She has betrayed me, like the others. He limped from the room, muttering curses, blood in his eyes. Meanwhile, Jane Boleyn twisted her hands, recalling how she had passed along the notes and kept guard during the Queen's secret meetings. She had meant no harm, or had she? Court survival rendered truth slippery. Guards arrived for Catherine that night, not in bluster but in cold silence. They escorted her to a chamber stripped of grandeur, devoid of mirrors or perfumes. There, alone as the state gathered its noose, she traced with numb fingers the ghost of her words, as though she might take them back, swallow them whole. But in Henry's court, love had no defense. Ink could kill as surely as steel. The crimson seal shattered like glass beneath Henry's trembling fingers. The parchment crackled in his hand, but he barely felt it. Archbishop Cranmer, rigid and silent, stood before him with a bowed head, eyes lowered to the marble floor. Bound them. A hush blanketed the chamber, heavy with the breathless anticipation of servants too wise to hazard a glance. Henry read each line of the letter as though it etched scars across his soul. The Queen, his Queen Catherine, his rose without a thorn, was accused of adultery, not only before their marriage, but after. 2 names leapt from the page, Francis Derham, Thomas Culpepper. One from the dust of her girlhood, the other from the heart of his own court. His fingers tightened until the parchment crumpled in his palm. He stood slowly, expression unreadable. Is this true? His voice was low and cavernous, more threat than question. It has not been proven yet, Cranmer said cautiously, but witnesses have come forward. Manox, Lascelles, even her own letters. Henry turned with sudden fury, his gout-ridden leg dragging behind him as he stalked toward the hearth. Lies grow like rot in the heart when a woman forgets her place. He shouted for his guards. Outside, the court shifted like startled birds. Orders flew. Men, loyal and frightened, moved fast. Arrest Derham first, Culpepper next. Jane Rochford was seized with neither grace nor warning. Catherine's ladies were pulled from her side. The silence of scandal descending on Whitehall was deafening. Henry, meanwhile, collapsed into his chair, and pressed trembling fingers to his temples. The betrayal festered not only as personal shame, but as political chaos. Had he not given her everything, lavished jewels, titles, adoration, and yet she dared. From admiration to loathing, the transition was feverish. He rescinded all patience. There would be no mercy, no trial if delay risked further embarrassment. Let Parliament act. Let the law bend. Henry would see his queen destroyed. Above all, the love turned to wrath, the wrath of a king, of a god was absolute. The winter of 1541 hung cold and dry over Hampton Court, as rumors whispered like frost through the corridors. Catherine, once radiant in the blush of her queenship, now moved with nervous grace. Servants paused longer than usual before bowing, and her ladies kept their voices low even in apparent comfort. Eyes shifted toward every open door. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. Something unspoken, dangerous. Archbishop Cranmer, pale and stricken, approached the king with trembling fingers. In his hand, a folded parchment sealed with wax. A letter from John Lascelles, detailing the Queen's past liaisons in the Duchess of Norfolk's chaotic household names like Henry Manox and Francis Derham, scrawled in ink that seemed weighted with doom. Cranmer hesitated, but Henry, increasingly irritable and fevered from his ulcerated leg, demanded to know. As Cranmer read, Henry's face cracked like porcelain bewilderment, giving way to crimson fury. Lies, all lies, he snarled, then recoiled, as if the very parchment burned his skin. The small flicker of suspicion seed, planted by an enemy, took root, and it grew fast. Derham was swiftly stead, dragged from his post at court, and questioned harshly. Under duress, he admitted to having pre-contracted himself to the Queen before her marriage to the King, a damning statement, easily twisted into evidence of treason. Worse yet, he accused her of favoring another, Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper, once casual in charm, now found his every step shadowed. Within days, he too stood in chains. His chambers were ransacked, and beneath a floorboard, a letter in Catherine's handwriting. It makes my heart die to think I cannot always be in your company. The letter broke her. When the contents were brought to Catherine, confined and quivering, her denial faltered. What had been romantic rebellion now became a matter of life and death. Spies repeated every whisper. Jane Rochford's role, once hidden behind veils of discretion, now tangled the Queen further into scandal. The court held its breath. The king, betrayed again, turned away from love and toward vengeance. The walls of the tower rose cold and gray around Catherine, swallowing sunlight and sound alike. Imprisoned in the Queen's house, she no longer moved through halls gilded with music and murmurs. Here, every hour was marked not by bells, but by the distant clink of armor, the scuff of boots, and the echoing dread of isolation. Catherine sat on the narrow wooden bench, her hands folded and raw beneath layers of fine but soiled linen. Her once lustrous hair, now dulled with neglect, hung in uneven waves. The silence pressed down more heavily than the stone ceiling, as if the fortress itself refused to speak of what it had seen. Paper and ink were forbidden. Voices were hushed. Even prayers died mid-whisper. Above all, no word from Henry. She replayed every misstep in tortured detail. The stolen glances, the two eager smiles, the midnight trysts whispered into locked doors. What had she yearned for but kindness and affection? Culpeper's voice, the quiet thrill of it, was now a ghost that haunted the corridor outside her locked room. A knock, one morning, shattered the quiet. It was not the king's reprieve, only a guard, solemn, to deliver the bone-shaking news. A bill of attainder passed in Parliament. No trial, no defense. The law had changed to fit her condemnation. Later, her request commuted, humble, a block in her chamber. Not to practice death, she told herself, but to meet it without shame. When the executioner's axe would fall, she wanted her spine to be steady, her head bowed by choice, not terror. Some nights she thought of Jane Rochford, somewhere nearby in a chamber of madness, muttering broken regrets to shadows. Sometimes Catherine envied her. The tower offered no answers, only silence. And in that silence, Catherine rehearsed the end not just of her life, but of her name, her innocence, and the fragile illusion that she had ever been more than disposable in a kingdom ruled by fear. The windows of the tower were laced with frost, and Catherine could see her breath coiling in, the air like a spirit escaping her lips. A stillness had settled over her narrow cell, broken only by the careful, deliberate movements of the guards who brought her meal, or the occasional murmur of prayer from down the hallway. She did not eat much anymore. Hunger had long given way to a persistent nausea, the kind that came not from illness, but from knowing there were no more tomorrows to digest. In the dim hours before dawn, she knelt on the cold stone floor, eyes fixed on the object before her. A low block, roughly hewn but shaped to mimic the final threshold she would soon meet. The wardens, perhaps out of cruel mercy or acknowledgment of her rank, had delivered it at her own behest. She placed her chin to it. Again and again, she practiced how to be still, how not to tremble, how to speak without letting her voice crack like thin ice over water. "The eyes of England will be upon me," she murmured, reciting a line she had said dozens of times before. I must not falter. In her mind, she rehearsed her final words, reworking and reshaping each phrase, stripping away what sounded false, holding only to what felt like truth. She wished to be remembered not as the light woman the court now scorned, not as a pawn but as someone who had loved. That too was her act of defiance. She adjusted her head a final time and whispered, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Silence answered. Outside, a bell tolled once. Practice was over. Tomorrow it would be real. The February morning hung cold and gray, the sky cloaked in morning clouds that refused to give even the smallest light. Catherine rose early, long before the tower bells rang. Her gown was laid out for her, a somber but regal velvet of deepest black, its edges trimmed in delicate white, echoing purity and mourning in equal measure. Her youthful face, though gaunt from weeks of confinement and fear, remained composed. Two ladies in waiting, their hands trembling, assisted her silently. One carefully drew her long chestnut hair back from her face, pinning it beneath a simple veil. Another handed her a crucifix, which she clutched tightly, fingertips pale from the grip. Her lips moved in prayer not for salvation, but for composure. When the yeoman came to escort her, she did not flinch. Her steps echoed through the stone corridor, muffled by the hem of her gown. Every pace toward the scaffold was an act of defiance in grace, in dignity, in silent resistance to the monstrous machinery that had chewed away her life. Outside, the scaffold loomed before a sparse crowd, silent save for the occasional cough and rustle. The executioner, imported from Calais for his swift blade, waited, impassive in his hood. Snow had begun to fall light, hesitant flakes dying on the ground. Catherine mounted the steps slowly. At the top, she turned. For a heartbeat, Her eyes swept across the sea of unfamiliar faces. She spoke, voice wavering only slightly. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." A gasp fluttered through the crowd. Then silence. Kneeling, she placed her hands before her and laid her cheek on the cold, oaken block, the one she had practiced on the night before. There was a breath, a pause, one final prayer whispered against wood. Then the sword fell. The queen's body stilled, and with it passed the last of her broken innocence. The first light of February 13, 1542, crept cautiously over the frost-covered stones of the Tower of London. Each ray touched the cold walls like a benediction withheld, as if the sky itself recoiled at what the morning demanded. Inside her sparse chamber, Catherine Howard stood silently, clad in a gown of solemn velvet, the hue of winter violets, trimmed in white chaste, ceremonial. Her golden hair was tucked beneath a modest cap, her fair face composed beneath weeks of quiet despair. She had practiced for this moment endlessly, and yet now the stillness roared. Her ladies helped button the bodice with trembling hands, their tears making the task more difficult. Catherine, impossibly still, whispered encouragement, "Do not weep. I go to God." Her voice, thin but strangely serene, seemed to guide them as much as herself. She was no longer 17, no longer the girl who giggled along corridors or blushed at glances. She had become a figure cut from sorrow and ritual, shaped by betrayal. The door creaked open. The king's men came for her. As she was led through the corridors, past the walls that had heard her laughter and secrets, Catherine's gaze did not falter. Ravens cried above the courtyard where the scaffold stood waiting, dusted with snow. The scaffold block requested days before felt familiar now, like a prayer answered in wood. The crowd gathered around it was silent. Even the air didn't dare stir. She turned to the priest, nodded, then stepped forward. The executionera, scarlet-cloaked Frenchman, known for his swift strikes, bowed low. There was no malice in his eyes, only fatigue. Kneeling, Catherine whispered her last words, lips brushing wood. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." The blade fell with a merciful hiss, and then only stillness and the cold morning standing watch. Pale light slanted through the narrow lancet windows of the tower chamber. Stone walls pressed close, shadows stretching long across the cold flagstones. Catherine sat unmoving upon her stool, a fragile figure barely more than a girl, her pale hands folded in her lap. She had not wept since the night before, when they took away her last lady-in-waiting. Silence settled around her like burial cloth. In the corridors beyond, boots echoed faintly, guards, changing shift perhaps, or another poor soul being led to Dover Tower. Catherine flinched at each sound now. Her thoughts moved sluggishly, weighed down by dread and fatigue. The block stood nearby, as she had requested. A plain, sturdy thing. It looked innocent, even banal, yet dismissing it as just wood seemed absurd, sacrilegious even. It had tasted the prayers and warm blood of queens before her. She had rehearsed kneeling, placing her neck. The executioner had been described as a Frenchman, swift and steady. She clung to that kindness as though it were a promise. Above all, she feared screaming. She did not want to die sobbing or broken. She wanted to show those who would watch, if any were brave enough, that she had once been a queen, and that, though young, she had been loved, if only briefly, if only secretly. She thought of Culpeper, of the silent meeting place where they had last stolen an hour together in frightened, fevered delight. Her chest ached with the memory, the longing, the wrongness of that hope they'd shared. A creak at the door. She turned. A guard. He said nothing, merely nodded. It was time. Catherine rose slowly, smoothing her linen shift. Shadows clung to her skin, pale and thin, but she held her head high. She walked into the fading light, toward the scaffold, each step quiet, determined, the hush of the tower whispering her farewell. The block was gone, the crimson velvet gown folded in some forgotten drawer, and the girl who once dared to smile beside a king now lay beneath a cold slab of stone, her name omitted from it. Time moved on, as it always does. But the shame branded upon the memory of Catherine Howard burned no less fiercely for its silence. London whispered her fate in alleyways and drawing rooms, a cautionary tale painted in scandal, not sorrow. Henry VIII survived her guiltless in his own eyes, a portrait of solemn grief, framed by flattery and sycophancy. He wept, not for Catherine, but for his pride. In public, he condemned her treachery. In private, he wiped away all mention of her. Parliament passed new decrees to prevent such disgrace from reaching the throne again. Yet those laws were written not to guard hearts, but to assert control. In love, there lay treason. In feminine secrets, the seeds of national peril. In those same halls where Catherine once stepped lightly, rumors shifted with the political wind. Some condemned her as a harlot who dallied with courtiers. Others whispered more quietly, she was a child, a pawn, a girl who never stood a chance. Jane Boleyn went mad and followed her into oblivion. Culpeper and Derham died screaming victims, like Catherine, of a kingdom where power required blood. The Howard name was scorched from court rolls, their ambitions buried in their shame, but history would not forget her. Centuries later, new voices, historians, novelists, daughters of another age, earthed her suffering. They saw not guilt, but grooming, not betrayal, but broken youth. Her final words, though perhaps apocryphal, echo through time. I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper. It was not treason, but a wish for tenderness in a world that had none to spare. Now, Catherine lingers like smoke in the tower Walsa name. Once in splendor, lost to ash, waiting to be remembered, not as a queen destroyed, but a girl devoured.